Welcome back to NC Realtors Redefined, the NC Realtors podcast. On this episode,
based on the hotline calls that I've been getting, the issue of scams is extremely prevalent. You guys as an industry are targeted far more even than me as a regular normie.
But first, do you have feedback on a story or topic that you'd like to hear covered on this podcast? Then give us a call at 336-550-4437. When leaving your voicemail, be sure to tell us your name and where you're from. Your comments may be used on a future episode of NC Realtors Redefined.
Hey everybody, my name is John Waite, and today I'm going to be presenting on scams. Now, I don't know if you guys know this, because surely you have not been bombarded with a scam today. I'm just kidding. You likely have been. The issue of scams is extremely prevalent. Based on the hotline calls that I've been getting, you guys as an industry are targeted far more even than me as a regular normie. And what I get is just incredibly overwhelming. It's everywhere. It's in my email. It's all the time. It's from places I don't expect. And the interesting thing is, in this day and age of AI, some of these scammers who maybe used to struggle with things like if they sent you an email, it looked all wonky, or maybe the way things were phrased was off. Even if you're not like a grammar snob like me, even some of these emails were, even for someone who's not that, would be able to figure out, oh, this looks way off, right? And now it seems to get more sophisticated, more kind of just inserted into your everyday life. And so I'm going to cover the most prevalent scams for you guys, just things to look out for, ways to avoid them. And then, we can, we'll delve into some of the less common scams as well. It certainly will not cover every single scam, but a lot of things I'll talk about today apply to other scams, including ones that I don't cover specifically today. So the first scam we're going to talk about is probably the one you guys encounter most often, which is the fake seller scams. And then we're going to talk about fake buyer scams, and then a few, I think there's 3 other scams that I'm going to talk about as well. And when it comes to the fake seller scam, if you're not aware of it, then you definitely need to be, and you are in the right place. Because this scam is definitely the most prevalent. And basically, it's exactly like the name says. Like, it is a fake seller. It is somebody who wants to convince you to list property that they don't own. And the goals of them doing that can be a lot of different things. But, if they win top prize for their scam, then that's going to be that the property closes and they walk away with the money. And the ability to get that money back is extremely difficult, especially if they happen to be out of the country. That's just how it is. Tracking the money down is hard. Even tracking who perpetrated it hard. It could be hard to perpetrate even what country it came from, depending on the circumstances. So that is the basis of the fake seller scam. But understand that, if you're doing due diligence fees and things like that, that money can be gone even if the scam doesn't go all the way to closing. And so it's one of those things you really want to be aware of, just because of that. So let's talk about the different things that go along with this. And by the way, just as a general proposition, before I even get into the details of the fake seller scam, before we even go there, let's have a little come to Jesus about our collective attitudes, shall we? Because one of the things that I think some people think, and surely I wouldn't be bringing this up unless I had thought this at one point in time. So, definitely you're in a no judgment zone here. But if you're someone today where if you're listening to this and you're like, there's no way, like I am smarter than that. I'm not going to get taken by these scammers, blah, blah, blah. If you think that you are somehow immune or too smart to be taken advantage of, let me just tell you that you would be wise to perhaps reflect on that particular belief. And the reason I say that is because at any given time, all of us can be managing 1,000 different projects. Okay. And nobody is immune when your brain is that scattered. So my best example I like to give on this is that my wife owns a store, and one day I will make the story short and just say that she received a scam phone call, and she was on the way out the door to go to Walgreens to buy gift cards to pay an electric bill because of what the scammer was doing, simply because at that moment in time, she was juggling a dozen different things and couldn't really focus on the fact that the person who was calling her, threatening to turn the electricity off on her store midday with drivers on the way to do so, was a scam. And I'll add to that story this, that before I was an attorney, I was living in a property and I was helping the landlord manage it, and I almost got taken advantage of by a scam from a potential renter, and it was a classic scam where, and some of you may have encountered this before, where the scammer sent me a check for the deposit and first month's rent and deposit. Mind you, I did all this and didn't know I probably needed to be licensed to be doing all this. So please, grant me a little bit of grace. I know now I wouldn't do this again. I didn't know at the time. I was just trying to help the landlord out, who's my friend who owned the property. And also I got a discount on my rent. But anyway, all that is to say, I wouldn't do it again. But, in this story, this potential renter sent me the check and everything, and then immediately started blowing up my phone with emergencies. And the funniest part of this story was actually that as part of this emergency, this renter said they lived in England. And so when he called me with the emergency he came up with, and maybe he thought this would resonate with a U.S. citizen, probably most U.S. citizens, because of the way our healthcare system works. I don't know. But anyway, his emergency was that his brother or sister had a car crash, and that they had to be airlifted to the hospital, and the hospital was demanding money. And I was just like, y'all have universal health care. What are you even talking about? Like, in the US, we would charge for something like that. But even then, those bills don't come for months. So what are you even talking about? Anyway, he really irritated me with how much he was blowing my phone. And so I just slow rolled. I didn't know what was going on. He just annoyed me. So I was like slow rolling, my response to his request. And I slow rolled it enough where the check bounced. And so fortunately, the landlord didn't incur any more than just a return check fee in that instance. But honestly, I didn't know I didn't understand it was a scam until the check bounced. And it was only then that I connected the dots. But that moment in time, I was actually in the middle of selling all my worldly possessions to go hike the Appalachian Trail. Yeah, no, my brain was scattered. I was not in a frame of mind to be paying attention. And that is what these people that is exactly the kind of thing they wait for and they hope for. So that it doesn't matter how smart you are. It does not matter even how educated you are. And I don't mean educated like in a school sense. I mean just, this could be your fifth scam class in the last month. Like, you could know everything about all this, but at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is you always have to be vigilant, because the minute you let your guard down, no matter who you are, no matter what, your capabilities are, you could be susceptible. So if you're just a cantankerous person who slow rolls things because people annoy you, you're actually in a pretty good spot, I think. Like, that's a pretty good way. That's a pretty good defense mechanism, because for almost all of these scams, at some point in time, the scammer is going to pull the card of urgency. And you have to do this, have to do this, have to do this. And, you guys encounter that all the time with people who are not scammers. So I think that your ability to process it is probably a lot better than me. But in any event, let's go to the details of the fake seller scam. Now that we've got a little bit of background on that, we've talked about the general proposition of nobody is immune. What is a fake? How do you spot it? Like, what are the main things you should be looking for? So number one, if it's vacant land, assume it's a scam. Just assume it's a scam unless you know the person. But even if you know the person, is that the person that's actually reaching out to you? If it's vacant land and you actually have a way to establish that you are conclusively 100% talking with the owner of that vacant land, sure, okay. You don't have to assume it's a scam until you prove otherwise. Otherwise, if it's vacant land, especially if it's not in your jurisdiction, then assume it is. So that is number one. So if you get your spidey senses up right away, just with that, empty house is not as common. The most common is vacant land. Okay. And so that is something that if it's either one of those two, make sure you've got your spidey senses going off, but especially the first one. Now, number two, if the seller will not meet in person or at least on a live video. If they're not willing to do that, forget it. If the seller will not meet in person on a live video, then assume it's a scam. But another related scam in this area is that the seller's like, yeah, sure, here's a Zoom link. Let's go ahead and meet. Don't click that link. Don't do that. That link is no different than any other link, any other time that you get an email. If it is, even if it's somebody that you do know and you get a link to be clicking on, don't do that. Okay. And if it looks suspicious at all, or if it's coming out of the blue or whatever, then don't click it, even if you know the person. But in this instance, you probably don't know the person. You're probably dealing with the seller that you've never had contact before. It's a new person. Do not click on Zoom links because, as you might suspect, that because the word is getting out that one of the best ways to spot a fake seller scam is by doing a live video meeting. Well, of course, now they've adjusted their tactics a little bit, and now they'll send you a link to meet with them on Zoom, but now your computer's infected and you've got a big problem. If you've never had your computer infected, it is a very annoying thing to deal with, and it can lead to big problems over time. So, make sure the processes you have in place for other scams in this arena, make sure you are following those. Okay. Honestly, the first two, if you follow these sorts of guidelines, you're probably going to weed out a lot of these attempted scams. Okay. And so make sure you really are focusing on the first two and doing them the right way. Send the scammer your own Zoom link or, FaceTime, whatever, something where you're not clicking on a link from them that could potentially infect your computer. Number three, if they insist that you only use their Zoom link, no, move on. And here's the other thing too, it's a related hotline question, but sometimes I get this question of, I know it's probably a scammer. An agent's calling me saying, hey, I know I've probably discovered a scammer. How do I get rid of them? They're usually the listing agreement's already been signed and stuff like that. And I'm just like, don't waste any more time on these people. Like, these people have already wasted so much of your time. This is a situation where honestly, you could just block them and just move on with life. Forget about it. Because if you establish after a listing agreement's been signed that you have a scammer, what is, blocking them going to do? Nothing. Just nothing. There's nothing to get. There's nothing to say. Your listing agreement is void anyway, because it's a scammer. It's not even a real person, or it might be a real person, but it's just not even, a person that owns the property. Everything that's based on is fraud. So number four, if the seller's overly eager, getting pushy, things like that, willing to take things under market value, trying to get the thing closed, wanting cash deals, things like that. Okay. Especially if you've never met them, you don't know anything about them. This is a number five. If you can do this, it can be a good one where you can say they tell you that they're calling you from, say, the Northeast, somewhere in New England or whatever, Pennsylvania or something like that. But if you're a person with the means to be able to tell what the IP address is that they're emailing or calling from, then you can verify, no, you're actually over in whatever, Malaysia or wherever it may be. Number 7 here, the family email address or phone numbers are from another country. Most of them are not going to do that now. They can spoof a local phone number, and a lot of them do that. So, but if it is from another country, that's obviously a red flag. Photo ID is barely legible. This comes up pretty often. If they give you an ID and it is not clear, then that is usually on purpose. Remember in Fargo, remember that movie? And he kept like smudging the VIN numbers on the cars. He kept doing it because he was selling fake cars to steal money. Anyway, if you haven't seen that movie, it's an oldie but goodie. Um, then number 9 here, the seller does not require due diligence fee or doesn't want earnest money. That's probably because they're trying to get the big cash to close, and they're trying to entice a buyer to move quickly, and they're giving a good deal. Blah blah blah. Yeah, sometimes they'll do that, and then that way there's less hurdles in the transaction to get to closing. Also, it makes it easier sometimes to get cash from a buyer. Seller makes excuses as not performing. That does happen too, where they keep dragging it out and dragging it out. Some of these, that's what they'll do, and there might be an issue with maybe being able to get the fake paperwork assembled or something like that. I'm not sure, but that definitely does happen. And then finally, like I said, at some point they will start getting angry and berating you, especially getting closer to closing, and it might be hard to decipher that from any other seller from some of the phone calls I get from you guys, but just understand that is definitely something. It's just something where it's a red flag. If you see it come up, then definitely do some further investigating. So on the fake seller scam front, listing agent do's and don'ts: do not just rely on an ID, and don't rely on any document that has a notarial certificate. They forge notary certificates all the time. So, if just because it has that, that is absolutely no, it's just no consideration. So make sure you do meet with this seller face-to-face or by live video. Make sure you verify ownership of the deed, and talking to neighbors. I don't even know. I've probably got at least a dozen phone calls over the last couple of years where the fake seller scam was averted by talking to neighbors. The neighbors know. Talk to them. You guys know this. The neighbors know everything. The neighbors love to tell everything. They love to tell everything, even to people that you wish they wouldn't tell it to. So go talk to neighbors. But the part of that problem has to do with the third do here, which is visit the property and ask the seller questions only the owner would know. So one of the things that's actually in this arena is the fact that a lot of these scammers have now taken to asking agents to list property that's well outside of their jurisdiction, well outside of their practice area. Why? Because they don't want you to go there. They don't want you to go to the property and ask questions. They don't want you to talk to the neighbors. They want to be able to do this, give you a juicy listing that is outside. They'll make up excuses for it. If you get a listing from a seller, who maybe hasn't given any of the red flags, but for some reason they want you to list property that is nowhere near your usual practice area, then you need to really press them why. Why would that be? Why don't you want an agent who's more local? And maybe you could even say, are you sure you don't want a referral for someone local? And if the answer to that is something weird, then it's probably a scam. So I know, like, when it comes to listings, especially if it's a big land listing, I know that's something that your temptation is going to be, I really want to keep this. This is a good vacant land listing. It's a really big tract. I'm going to get a certain amount of commission for this. That's, very enticing or whatever. And that's the other thing too. Like, if there's no negotiation on that, especially if it's that kind of a listing, ordinarily there would be somebody, especially if you would expect them to be a sophisticated seller. If they're not asking those questions, then why aren't they asking those questions? So when it comes to that, if you visit the property, make sure you're asking things only the seller would know. Like, if you start talking about a shed that's on the property, and then the seller is talking all about how, oh yeah, well, I need to get rid of that thing or whatever, but you're standing at the property not looking at a shed, then it's a scammer. There's features about the property that you can't get from like Google Earth or Google, when you put the little orange dude man on the road, whatever that's called. Anyway, there's just things about the property that's going to be there that you could ask only they would know. Another thing you could ask for is things like utility bills. If there's utilities at the property, you could ask for, things that only the seller would have, like plats or whatever, like, unrecorded plats anyway. So I don't know. There's a lot of ways you can do that, but the biggest thing is if you cannot visit the property, it's just such a major red flag that you need to really, really do a lot of digging. And I would also say you really need to think about if you're a BIC, then you really need to think about whether your firm needs a policy whether agents are even going to take these kinds of listings in the first place. So make sure that on that end, you're doing what you need to do to protect your firm and to, make sure that your agents are asking the right questions, even if you're not being involved right away, at the beginning of the transaction. Contact FBI or local law enforcement. They keep a database, so you can do that. It's one of those things where the chances of, getting the money back are very slim with these transactions. So contacting that is usually kind of a post-mortem, especially if it closes. But if it hasn't closed yet, you can let them know. It might be something they could help out on. You may be in a local board, or your local board may have some other tools. Make sure that those local tools that you're updating them. I don't want to talk too much about that now because it's not like widespread yet, but just talk to your local association, see if they have some tools other than forewarned. There's other tools other than forewarned your local board may have. So it's something to talk to them about. I do want to take a minute when it comes to the fallout on this, if it closes. These fake seller scams, if they close, I've never had a case that I've been involved with or talked to anyone about where the closing attorney's first reaction is, "Oh, well, sorry, my bad, bro, my bad. I take full responsibility." Yeah, no, that ain't happening. Pretty much everyone's first response is, "Well, you're the listing agent. How come you didn't even know you didn't even have a real seller?" And that's not necessarily in my view, a fair accusation. It's not. When it comes to these transactions, almost everybody probably deserves some kind of blame, except depending on the circumstances, the buyer agent, but we're going to talk about buyer agents in just a second. They don't get a free pass. Okay. But at the same time, if you're looking at sort of the general percentages of where blame can be cast, then listing agent almost gets blamed the most, I think. And then closing attorney probably second, depending on the circumstances, depending on the transaction. So just know that when it comes to these listing agent do's and don'ts, these are extremely, extremely important. And then finally, social media that can help. Same thing. Talking with neighbors. I mean, neighbors are again a really good way. All right. When it comes to buyer agents, so if you're a buyer agent in one of these vacant land transactions, how do you know that it's not a scam? Well, first of all, don't take the listing agent's word for it. And I'll be honest, I get too many phone calls on the hotline from buyer agents where the buyer agent is doing what they should do and asking the listing agent difficult questions about whether they really have a real seller or not, and the listing agent gets mad. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that if you're the listing agent and you're the buyer agent. That should be a red flag. We're not asking for, the identity of the seller or something like that necessarily. The question is, what have you done as the listing agent to make sure that your seller is a real person and it's not an insult? Because here's the thing, even though I've been talking about this now pretty regularly for at least a year and a half, every single place I go and speak, between a dozen and 24 times a year. And pretty much every place I go, I'll be talking about scams. I could be talking about something completely unrelated. I could be on an antitrust speech. I will somewhere fit in scams. That's how important of a topic this is. Okay. So if you're a buyer agent and you're asking those questions, you're getting pushback from a closing attorney and listing agent, that is time to panic, in my view. They should be a lot more open about, here's what we've done to verify everything. We feel good. And then it's like, okay, well, just so these are things that I need to be doing to make sure I look out for my buyer. Because if the buyer's money all gets taken at closing and it disappears, then it's not like, it's very unlikely anyway that a litigation attorney on behalf of the buyer to get their money back is just going to be like, we'll just pick one or two people to go after. No. They're going to go after everybody. So the buyer agent has exposure here, even though, like I said, I think that they're, in a legal sense, unless they've actually done something negligent, I think that usually in most cases, their liability there is a little bit less of a chance of being found liable. But for naming you as a defendant in a lawsuit, all they really need is just some kind of evidence that you didn't do your job, and that's it. So and that's all it really takes to get wrapped into one. And you don't want to do that. You don't want to risk that. In any event, Also, don't assume that the lawyer knows what they're doing. Definitely don't do that. Okay. Definitely don't. And like I said, make sure if you get any pushback from either one of them, that you really press them and you talk about how, this lawyer on Mobile Monday got on there and just talked about how the world is ending with all these scams. I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. But you could just say that you have recently learned from a credible source how important it is as a buyer agent for you to verify that the transaction is going to go according to plan for your client. These are not things that, these are just things where you could ask the listing agent, you could send them an email in writing and say, hey, have you done these things? And if the listing agent doesn't, they can just say yes, no, whatever. And if the answer to any of these is no, well, then yeah, no, dig further. But notice that none of these really, ask who's your seller. I want to do my own background check on your seller and their name. That's not what these questions are. So for me personally, I just think they're fair game. And I think listing agents should be able to answer those. And I think listing agents and the closing attorney should be able to answer a lot of those same questions. And if they can't, then what's the lawyer doing? Because at the end of the day, nothing really happens without the lawyer. Now, granted, closing attorneys, especially high volume practice, maybe their ability to really, sniff these things out with 100% accuracy is not that great. But my understanding is most of the time, the closing attorney is not taking as close of this a look at this in every case as maybe they should. So it's just something that I think that you need to be aware of. Obviously, not all closing attorneys are the same. Some offices, do a very thorough job on it. So I'm not throwing stones, but there are other offices, especially other offices that are more old school, where yeah, they may not be doing that kind of check. So just understand it's something to look at and something to ask about is how I would phrase it. And then recommend your client seek further guidance from a lawyer if you suspect a scam. You as the buyer agent, you don't have to take on all the responsibility here. If you suspect it's a scam, tell your client to go get a lawyer. That is not something you necessarily have to litigate. If nobody believes you, you don't have to go around, yelling about this into the void. If they're only going to take a lawyer seriously, then it's better to recommend your client spend some money on a lawyer than for them to lose all that money. All right. Do ask the closing attorney what their verification procedures are and what they've done. So yeah, closing attorney, listing agent, they shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. You can definitely be disciplined by the commission if one of these scams goes through. Okay. However, understand that your discipline from the commission is probably not going to match how bad the lawsuit is, especially if you're the listing agent. If one of these closes. And I'll just give you one example that I know about is that, there's a case that I'm aware of where the discipline from the commission, yeah, they got discipline from the commission. The listing agent did. But when it came to the lawsuit itself, listing agent, contacted their E&O because there's a closing. We've got a big problem here. It's a big money problem. And the E&O didn't even want to cover it. And then ended up, having to decide whether to sue the E&O or not. So you have to understand that, these cases, the closing attorney, they're probably going to get sued as well. In a lot of these cases, if a lawsuit gets filed, they also have malpractice insurance, and that malpractice insurance very likely probably doesn't want to cover the lawyer either. So now you have two insurance companies who don't really want to cover, and some E&Os actually exclude this from coverage. So if you're not sure on that, make sure you double check it and make sure where you're at, or if you need certain policies or procedures in place to get coverage, do that. But in any event, just know that these cases get very, very messy and can, result in lawsuits, not just when it comes to the agents or the closing attorney involved in the transaction, but it also involves some of the insurance carriers. So, and obviously that is a big, big mess. All right. If you do get scammed, let's say that. What happens if you get scammed anyway? Obviously, you got to contact, your client. And unfortunately, I have had those hotline calls where, the agent will call, say what's happened, and then I unfortunately have to be the one to tell them, I'm really sorry. It sounds like this scam is complete. And, too bad we couldn't have got to it sooner, but that's just how it is. So you got to tell your client that's happened, but not before you contact your email. You can report it to the FBI. IC3.gov is where you can do that, and then local law enforcement, as we've discussed. All right. So that's, as far as fake seller scams, that is really the main nuts and bolts of it. Hopefully that gives you the tools you need to avoid those. I would love a day where I don't get any more phone calls about agents getting scammed on it. They're sad calls. I don't like them. And honestly, I feel for all parties involved whenever I get those calls, because again, you guys didn't ask for it. And for some agents, it's not for lack of trying. Like, they actually do a lot of the things that I'm talking about. It's still not enough. The sophistication of these scammers can be very, very good. So anyway, just be aware of that. But let's move on to fake buyer scams, because these are also not the same thing that I talked about at the beginning. You're not immune to these. And I know people personally who've been taken advantage of on these. And again, it's not because you did something wrong if you're a victim of one of these scams. They are just very, very good at what they do. So the pig butchering scam, this has been around a long time. You've seen this in movies. It's a confidence man scheme, right? They get in there and they talk about how they've made all this money doing this and that, or they accidentally reveal they have too much money, or however they do it. Somehow, some way, they make it seem like they just found the get rich easy train. And if you want to jump on it, you can jump on it. And they tell you all about how you can jump on it. Well, a lot of times, you'll jump on it with them if you fall victim of one of these scams, and they'll actually give you a return on your initial investment. That's a lot of times how they will entice you to make a much bigger investment. And then when you make that much bigger investment, whatever it may be, then suddenly that second investment's gone. So, or maybe they'll take you for more. If they think you got more, maybe they'll give you 2 or 3 good investments in a return on it. And then suddenly, blammo, gone. So just know that this scam's been around a long time, and in its current iteration, a lot of times it's on WhatsApp. It'll be random messages, or you'll have a buyer client. You've actually signed up with a buyer agency agreement, and then they'll start talking about this stuff. I've seen stories with crypto. I've seen stories with gold. They just somehow, some way claim they got rich easy, and they can make you rich easy as well. All you need to do is upload some money to this portal, and then we'll be in business together. So don't do that. Wire fraud buyer, still a thing. Still a thing. People are still lurking out there. I just got a phone call last week where a scammer tried to change closing instructions. And actually, no. Last week I got one where a scammer tried to, and then I think it was the week before that, a scammer successfully changed the wiring instructions to a wrong account. So this used to be, wire fraud used to be a lot bigger a couple of years ago. It is not gone. So you have to be very diligent about your security systems with your electronics in your firm, okay? That has not changed. They are still out there. They're still doing it. And actually, there's one now where I can't remember. Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But just so you know, they are still out there. They try to substitute banking information. They will, the buyers will do it, or maybe it'll be a scammer who somehow infiltrated your system, whatever. There could be people that aren't involved in the transaction at all. You're just clicking some kind of link to give them access to your information. And then, so understand that stuff is still out there. Some other kind of scams, wholesaler fraud scam is a little bit less common, but it does happen from time to time where I call it the wholesaler fraud scam, but I've also seen it in other contexts where it's just a buyer who gets upset, or maybe who's being overly aggressive or whatever. But basically what they do is they'll file some kind of, cloud on title document. I guess I'll call it that. It can take all sorts of things. I've seen it like purported affidavits or, whatever. Sometimes they'll just record a contract. But basically the goal is to cloud the title so that the seller can't sell it without, paying them some kind of ransom. This is fairly, like I said, it's not as common, but if you see it, just know that, we recommend that the owner go get an attorney. A lot of times these clouds on title, the reason they're not as prevalent is because there are some very juicy legal claims that you can bring against these people. So, and usually these people are local. So people are usually smart enough not to file these sorts of false recordings in the chain of title because of those potential juicy claims that can be brought. I mean, they're good. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but let me just say there's been a couple times where I recommended it and I'm just like, I don't know why this person did this because if this lawsuit gets filed, they're going to get hosed. So anyway, just know that that's there. The owner has plenty of options and it's something that they can avail themselves of. Fake landlord scam. This is, to me, one of the saddest ones because it's so easy for the scammer to do. And for a tenant, I mean, you know how tenants are, and we've all been in that position, or at least I have been, as someone who used to have very little money, especially in their 20s. But yeah, it could take tenants, months or to save up first month's rent plus security deposit. And then the way that these scams work is, a lot of times the scammer will just pull stuff from your listing. Like if you're an agent, do a fake rental scam. And then, it doesn't take much. They'll just set up a fake portal for the tenant to, go under lease to rent property that's vacant and listed for sale. And that's part of the reason why it works is because these properties are vacant. And then, they walk away with security deposit, first month's rent. And for a lot of tenants, it's just a very, very sad situation. So if you're a listing agent and you see this come up, make sure you report it. I know for a fact that TikTok will take those things down if you report them. They seem to be like they're somewhat on top of that. So anytime you see it, do what you can to report it and get them down. You may well be saving a tenant from some significant financial difficulty. So, if you're a listing agent, do a solid like that. I'm sure that it will not go unappreciated. Finally, ID theft scams. This has been, if you're a board member of a local board, or if you're an AE of a local board, or even just staff member of a local board, if you're involved with your local board somehow, some way, if you can talk to your AE in particular, or staff, or whatever, there's been scammers calling and trying to change member emails. And the reason that they're doing that is obviously because they want to be able to have member emails sent to them. And it's causing all sorts of havoc. So make sure that if you are a local board, you got to have some kind of system where you are going to verify with someone, probably by call. I mean, the easiest one would be similar to the wire fraud warning that is in the agency agreements for NC Realtors, as well as the contracts for NC Realtors. And that's this. Like, if you're going to prevent wire fraud, the easiest way to do that, by the way, if you're an agent, then don't ever, if your client asks you a question about changes in wiring instructions, don't just say that looks good. Don't ever say that if you're the agent. Say instead, contact the closing attorney directly. Call them, or call whoever it is. If it's a seller, like a buyer making a payment to a seller for a due diligence fee on a wire, call the seller directly. Don't talk to me. I'm just an agent. I don't get involved in that kind of thing. Okay. That's a side note. But if you're a local board and you're getting a phone call from someone to change an email address, just say, let me check on that. And then hang up. Call the agent directly on the number you have on file and see if they even called you. So before you change an email, make sure you're doing something like that to verify that you're even getting the request from the member. So that's all I have for you on scams. Hopefully this was helpful, and really appreciate you guys tuning in today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for listening to NC Realtors Redefined. Be sure to never miss an episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or SoundCloud.